Hey, it's December 19th, 2022 at 1 p.m. my time, and it's another confounding day in so many different directions. You know, it's incredible to see millions of people responding in almost hysteria to the Twitter files. Now, interestingly enough, I've been getting a little bit more insight than the original draft of the Twitter files through Matt Taibbi's tweets. And what I find extremely fascinating is the reaction has become the news rather than what exactly he is revealing and why. Now, I've heard a couple of interviews over the weekend, some pretty high profile interviews with Matt Taibbi, with Russell Brand, and of course, Crystal Ball and Sagar, and among others. But those two in particular, I thought were fascinating because as the Taibbi, or I should say the Twitter files unfolds, as of last week, the hysteria that we saw from, let's just say, Trump supporters was that, look, there is evidence that the Biden administration had used the force of the agencies and institutions of the United States to censor specific voices on the right. And ultimately, it was, at least I think, the kind of, the big whodunit was Hunter Biden's laptop. Well, from where I'm sitting, that appears to be the hook to getting a lot of people on that side of the political aisle as part of a trick that Elon Musk furthered because he did have access to very interesting information, that he did provide Matt Taibbi very interesting information. And what's just fascinating about this in the world of social media is that, particularly on Twitter, with the kind of the ravenous lunatics on the far right that are suddenly championing Matt Taibbi as if he was one of them the whole time, which of course he wasn't or isn't. And he's just a journalist. He's had some very peculiar questions in my mind for the last, I'd say, couple of years. But that seems to have led to this moment in a way that makes more sense than it had before. But I have been a significant fan, I guess you could say, of Mr. Taibbi's work, really going back to the great financial crisis. And he was, I think, at the top of really the journalists that actually got to the right points about what had taken place to shape our country and communicated in a way that regular people could understand. And his sort of studio, if you will, of his artwork of these amazing 10,000 word essays appeared in Rolling Stone magazine because they gave him the time and space to be able to tell very complex stories. But the way he managed to do it was to convey it in a way that all of us could understand, that there was just a simple street crime happening with what appeared to be the most sophisticated financial apparatuses in our country. And then he had a lot of takeaways that painted a very important picture. So Matt Taibbi's work throughout the years has just been outstanding, and but yet he's in a new territory. He's in a new place, and he changed the paradigm, quite frankly, with Elon Musk. And the only judgment that I might have in terms of trying to understand motivation is, okay, well, nothing else is delivering what appears to be the power behind the curtain, as it relates to censorship. Okay. And it's legit. It's very important to understand that the FBI and the national security state, the Division of Homeland Security, were working in cahoots to buy data to inform Twitter of whom could be, I guess, mitigated would be the right sort of approach to it. Voice mitigated, right? Censored. Why? Well, Trump being, for starters, a good place to start, considering he created an insurrection using Twitter, among other elements that we still haven't seen yet. And I do know that the January 6th committee, I believe, are forwarding criminal referrals to the DOJ today based on their investigation. But if they don't answer the questions, and I'll be really curious to see if there were other players, which they haven't done yet, but who are the other players, like I've said sometimes before, in these truth bombs, like Blackwater and the Koch brothers and the Mercers and big time money that had the opportunity to get some of the professional mercenaries and goons in the form of cops to Washington, D.C. to literally, challenge the D.C. police, and then also be on the inside of the FBI and other aspects. I mean, it's pretty easy to understand why the National Guard didn't show up, because Donald Trump would have had to make that call, right? But in terms of the FBI and other apparatuses, and I think that was actually on full display, and I haven't seen the documentary yet about Pelosi, but I mean, it looked like Congress was trying to get the National Guard to show up, and they weren't, because of just this insanity. But meanwhile, and I think this is the most important thing to look at, because of just the lightning speed that DOJ was able to arrest Sam Bankman-Fried on this FTX Alameda scheme that involved, of course, some of the most recognizable celebrities in the United States and around the world, as well as, of course, our political class. And there was a statement that I heard today by a online personality who was maybe more than that. I mean, I don't even know how to frame her. I think she's just kind of a personality, honestly. I don't know if I'd call her a journalist. She's a political pundit, I guess, is really what she is. But Brianna Greyjoy made some really interesting points in this revelation about Sam Bankman-Fried's donations to both sides of the aisle and what it means. But she used a term that I thought was very fascinating and hit really close to home. And she called it I don't know why I'm hung up on this, because shadow is leaping into my mind, because shadow funding is all over the place, dark money, that sort of thing, post Citizens United in terms of influence and donations. But that's not what this, she's referred to it as straw donations. Now, the reason that's important is because in our documentary, The Con, we start with this horrific story where an elderly Black African-American woman who was a widow, who owned her house outright, had to shoot herself in the chest a number of times as the police were there to evict her from a house that she had lived in for 4 decades. And as we went further and further into the story, we discovered that she had owned her home and that it didn't make sense that she was being evicted, in so much that she had gone to a bunch of different agencies and said she was receiving foreclosure postings on her house and nobody would help her. And then eventually the cops showed up and they were going to evict her into the streets, so she shot herself. Absolutely horrible story, no matter how you carve it up. But what was happening at that time, that was literally all over the place in Akron, Ohio, and throughout the Midwest, and we ended up finding, the chief investigator from the FBI, who revealed all of this stuff at that time period, which was really the early 2000s to 2008-ish, in mostly minority neighborhoods. There was an activity, and we discovered this down in Georgia too, by the way, called straw buying. And straw buying requires that someone create a loan based on an asset, based on documentation fabrication, where they might discover elderly women who were living on fixed income who own their houses to write loans against. And then they would work with somebody within a bank to be able to get those loans processed, because at the time, as we've been revealing, and not nearly enough people understand this, that the entirety of our mortgage industry at that time was involved with what is known as liar's loans. A lot of times people misallocate the term subprime crisis to what was taking place, but subprime is a misnomer. It's not exactly what the problem was. At that time period, there was an element known as ninja loans, which meant no income, no asset. Those loans were being approved, honestly. You could be, for example, a gardener that was an illegal immigrant in the state of California, and you could get a loan for like $700,000 for a beautiful house, that you had no idea how that's possible, but they just told you a number that you could afford, and so you did it, and they try to keep you in it for 90 days, and then they'd shuffle you out of it and they'd foreclose on you. But the people putting the deals together made money on fees, and that was just the setup. There was a lot more granular information that goes with that, but people were just set up, so any way you look at it, maybe the gardener in California got a hell of a deal, a screaming deal, and he didn't know to sell the house fast enough, because then he could have walked away with a huge upside if he was a part of the con. But in this particular example, he would just become a victim of being set up in a contract that he didn't understand. That happened in millions of contracts. But beyond that, major institutions like Countrywide and Ameriquest at that time, and interestingly enough, if you compare and contrast a lot of what's going on with FTX right now and Sam Bankman-Fried, a big part of the story is, of course, the celebrities like Tom Brady and Larry David and Matt Damon, and it's incredible, right? And Stephon Curry and others, just many that are crossing my mind, Shaquille O'Neal, I guess, and many others, were basically promoting that, these were great investments, and to get involved, and they put their credibility and their, celebrity behind it, which isn't unlike what has been going on, by the way, in Asia for the same purpose. But go back to the early 2000s, and companies like Ameriquest, for example, were advertising at the Super Bowl and promoting concerts like the Rolling Stones. Okay, I mean, they were mainstream, just like what we're seeing in FTX, and it gave it a sense of credibility. Now, meanwhile, as all of that's happening, these companies like Ameriquest, for example, they've got these fix-it shops where their brokers had to meet quotas, and they were high quotas. And what they would do is they would find people that would do anything possible to get loans signed, because they needed the volume, because they'd have to get the volume in the loans, because they were getting loaned warehouse lines from huge investment banks on Wall Street, to where these small brokers who were just sales companies for these huge investment banks were getting paid fees in basically huge money, as long as they could get people to get into a loan. And so they would do it by any means necessary. They would literally white out W-2 forms and change their tax records or their income records or their collateral, and this is what we show you in the con, to where they could get a loan approved. Why would they do that? Well, because they couldn't keep their job if they didn't get the loans approved, and everybody in the system, from the underwriters within these institutions, were paid to rubber stamp getting these loans approved, even though they were liars' loans. Now, it was such a race to the bottom at that time, like all pretenses were off. I mean, by the time we get to ninja loans in like the early 2004 period, it was such just an absolute disaster in the housing market that it was like they couldn't, it was like a heroin fix. That's why I think of all of the things that have happened ever since, that, everybody in the sort of universe of this stuff is like, you're either a pimp, a whore, or a junkie. And I'm talking about the elites that enabled all this happen, to where we go back to Breonna Greyjoy when she was talking about this morning, pardon me, straw donations. So Sam Bankman-Fried is apparently, what he's doing is they're masking contributions to both political parties as being donations from wealthy individuals. Nobody's doing any sort of background check on that. And so, both parties are taking money because they need it to advertise to win. And that's the way we've set this whole thing up, right? That's why the duopoly has so much sort of, submissiveness to those that are writing the checks. And in this country, in 2022, your money is speech. Money is speech. Speech is money. You want something done to serve you, you got to pay for it. That's how it works in the United States. So all of that stuff of like equal elections and everything else, even though it is pretty impressive, quite frankly, that, all things considered, because I can tell you, big oil and big finance and big military industrial and big healthcare and all of those types of things, a lot of the times we're donating to the Republicans, but they were also donating hugely to the Democrats. I mean, that's the thing. It's just pay to play. Okay, if you got the money and you're making money from the system, you're paying the legislatures to write the laws for you. And so this whole thing, Sam Bankman-Fried kind of came under the umbrella because he had, credibility because he was buying interest in the media, as it turns out. Everybody's on the take. Nobody has credibility. And go back to, remember I said straw donations, go back to straw buying. Straw buying during the times of Ameriquest, and as it turns out, Ameriquest was the largest subprime lender in the country, bigger than Countrywide at that time. And the top guy there is a gentleman by the name of Roland Arnall. And as it turns out, Roland Arnall was providing more in donations to the Bush administration than even Exxon or any apparatus of the military-industrial complex, or even Saudi Arabia for that matter, to put things into perspective. That's how much money was being made in the subprime liar's loans scenario, debacle. So in 2004, and this is what's happening right now today, going back to the Twitter files and everything that Matt Taibbi is revealing because of Elon Musk opening up the books and allowing him to do the investigative reporting, that shows that the FBI was engaged in censoring voices on the right. And I'm sure they were censoring voices on the left, and I'm sure they're censoring my voice, to be quite frank with you. But I have a feeling what's censoring my voice more than all others is the fact that we're not shelling out tens of thousands of dollars, or hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy clicks, likes, and shares, and all of those kinds of things, which I know you can do. I don't know how you can do it, but I know you can do it. But I think that's, who we're seeing has millions of clicks and views and that sort of thing that are manipulated. But the corollary between these stories is just amazing, and it never ends. And so you have Matt Taibbi revealing again the FBI doing something that the right is going absolutely haywire about and blaming the Democrats. But as it turns out, the right under George Bush was just fine, apparently, with the FBI. Well, as it turns out, this is how it worked. The FBI had the liar's loan subprime national crime ring dead to rights, and they were about to pull the noose on this whole thing. And as it turns out, and this is just kind of a funny, elixir of history, as it turns out, the former attorney general under George Bush at the time was Anthony Gonzales, right? Yeah, Gonzales. And he had taken resources away from the FBI to go after white-collar fraud, made it low end in terms of what it was that were priorities for the FBI. That include, of course, terrorism at that time period because of what happened after 9/11 that we never got to the bottom of. Unlike Sam Bankman-Fried, that God, 9/11 is a whole nother story. But my point being that they decided to allocate resources to go and tackle porn rings. I shit you not. They took resources away from going after white-collar fraud that would blow up the world, that would be financial terrorism, that would do more wreckage to this country than Osama bin Laden could ever dream of. And they reshifted it to porn, which is interesting if you're watching all of the stuff happen on Twitter these days. It seems like the categories that the right seems to go absolutely bonkers about, it's almost like cocaine for these guys. I mean, they get a sniff of this stuff, or crack, I should say, and they go apeshit. And most of it, a lot of it, is like through pedophilia, right? So think about, there's this group of people on the right that awkwardly are always talking about some sort of like cabal that's hiding pedophilia. Obviously, they're talking about, Epstein and that sort of thing, and Clinton, and they always leave out Trump, who was up to his eyeballs in Epstein at that time period. In fact, it turns out that Epstein introduced his Melania to Trump. Okay, I don't see the right talking about that, but at the same time, it's all about these like, it's almost like people have been trained that they hear these things, and it's almost like Pavlov's dog, where they hear something, they go freaking nuts about it without seeing the forest through the trees. So they're all animated about destroy the FBI, but at the same time, during this disaster that blew up the world, it was the FBI that was trying to do its job that a Republican president and a Republican attorney general clipped. And was like, no, you're not going to tackle the real crime. What you're going to do is you're going to go after a make-believe crime that we can, suss out, because it's one of those things that, has been around for a long time because sex is taboo for a lot of people. which is really fucking weird. I mean, it goes back for me. It's like in the SNL crisis, as it turns out, there was a guy by the name of Charles Keating who was the CEO of Lincoln Continental, which ultimately had the largest bankruptcy in the country up to that time, that ultimately gave us Alan Greenspan. And as it turns out, this guy, who was up to his eyeballs in insane fraud, which is just insane as the fraud that Sam Bankman-Fried is involved with, 32 years later, pretty much, right? No, what am I talking about? 32 years? More like 42 years later. But in the way it evolves. But, but now the tide has turned, the blame is shifted, because it's like, if an enemy of my enemy is my ally, and all of those sorts of weird mental gymnastics that come where people just can't see pollution of corruption and fraud for the sake of those things, for influence of political power that happens apparently on both sides of the aisle, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about. And yet the thumbprints of what I reveal to you are happening over and over and over, and nobody can understand them or see them. It's almost as if, I'd take the corollary, and I was thinking about this morning, that atoms are everywhere around us. They're the building blocks of everything that exists, but yet we can't see them. That's kind of what corruption in this era of disinformation and misinformation and overwhelming information and wrong information and chasing the psychology of those push button, issues, especially in the culture wars that make us all go crazy, is leading us into an absolute nosedive. I mean, I think we've been in a nosedive for a very long time, but it seems like the next phase of whatever is coming next, whatever that is. I mean, that's always the way it's going to be. But I mean, like almost like a crisis that could potentially put everything that came before to shame. And if that's the case, it could be the end of the world. I don't want to talk about Armageddon, in a spiritual sense, but it's just like, how much worse can this get? I mean, think about it. We go from in the 2000s, 9/11, the 2008 Great Financial Crisis, COVID, and now coming out of COVID, inflation and whatever comes next, which could be the mother of all bubbles. But as this all unfolds and you're asking yourself for some sort of clarity and orientation and how things work, listen, mainstream media gets little pieces and they respond in an echo chamber sort of 24-hour way where they try to vector towards what everybody's talking about without understanding the entirety of the story. And the entirety of the story as it relates to financial fraud that's what is the cornerstone of our economy. What Sam Bankman-Fried and other Bitcoin operators have been doing for some time, and I think 4 of them that I'm aware of, were playing the same game in the last 6 months. They were creating value out of thin air with tokens that the market makers gave a value to that people blindly trusted, that then were used by these operations for internal collateralized trades like derivatives. And, it wasn't, terms of service. They didn't agree to have their investments turned into immediate funny money to basically go to the roulette table. All of these Bitcoin operators, the crypto exchanges, and even unfortunately, I suppose, although it could be used for good as well, but the blockchain stuff kind of in between has enabled a whole lot of laundering and dark money, and nobody's going to argue with that. But it's also mostly the fraud of these engines, of these exchanges in Bitcoin, saying that they have X amount of value that they loan against that has zero, literally value in the collateral, except for what they say it does. And then they try to gin up what people will invest in. That's the whole thing, is if you can get the next guy to invest more than what you did, then you can keep the engine going, and it always ends, right? And that's basically a Ponzi scheme. In the case of Sam Bankman-Fried, John Ray just referred to it as simple embezzlement, which it mostly is. And yet there's a lot more to it at the same time. But everything that they're emulating is what I'm revealing to you that the federal government did in the aftermath of the financial crisis. To create the value of the homes based on liar's loans, they created inflated value through appraisal fraud that went into underwriting fraud, that went into lending fraud, that all the stopgaps, including Warren Buffett's Moody's, put AAA on these tranches that they sold to pensions in municipalities and countries around the world, were all designed to blow up. And they were all designed to make fees along the way. If you ever saw the Big Short, you see Margot Robbie in a hot tub talking, basically like it's a casino. But really what it is all smoke and mirrors to generate fees based on made up value. That's the easiest way to describe it. And then when it blew up, and all of these investment banks and all of these too big to fail institutions that were involved with this stuff, very similar to what Sam Bankman-Fried did on a much smaller level, then they had their hands out to where we call it the federal government bailed them out, but it was the Federal Reserve working on behalf of the banks that gave them trillions of dollars that was based on the full faith and credit of the United States for collateral that was worth nothing to create liquidity so they could get back on their feet, and they had an endless pump to do so. Or in this case, you might want to think of it as endless supply of fucking heroin. I mean, because ultimately what these too big to fail banks did was they were so cash rich that they ended up doing stupid ass shit like having these incredible, investment, why can't I even think of the name? Not just the investment banks. What am I trying to think of from Silicon Valley? Venture capitalists, right? Throwing hundreds of millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars into something that they did no due diligence on. Because the money was free, they're popping in here, they're taking fees off the top. And if you throw that into other commodities that follow a same sort of trajectory, housing, the Federal Reserve was purchasing, 100 cents on the dollar, the bonds, the securities, mortgage-backed securities, $180 billion a month. So it's just a facade for rich people to skim off of. Meanwhile, everybody's at each other's throats on these cultural wars, and oh my God, who's the FBI working for? Who's the FBI censoring? Who's got all these different agencies going through my mind. What did we come up with after, for Division of Homeland Security? Among others. I mean, come on. I mean, we're off the rails, batshit crazy. Guys, we're a failed state. This is just a bunch of insanely leveraged, corrupt institutions having access to the fuel, which is the Federal Reserve. And once they have that, they can buy politicians to write legislation to make sure that they can go after guys like Sam Bankman-Fried and not Trump or any of the CEOs that were involved with this stuff. It's a mess. It's a gigantic mess. And what we have is the ability to unpack it for you. And it's in the con at www.thecon.tv. And it's also, I think, the most important accomplishment that we've done in the last year or so is we had a live presentation from the Federal Reserve itself where we laid out a lot of these facts in a huge, I would call it filibuster to the grand jury of the American people with a lot of facts that no one's ever heard. And that's at Patrick Lovell Truth Bombs the Con on YouTube. And it's called 11.1.22. Deception owns you. Thanks for tuning in. We've got the answers the world is in desperate need of. We just need to somehow break through the space to jar people to understand that we're the ones who did the work that the entirety of all of these agencies failed to do. And now you can see that they do it quite often. Onwards and upwards.